My presentation will be on the background, reasons for, macroeconomic effects, and proposed solutions of child labor. First, I'd like to set a standard definition of child labor since there might be some confusion. Set by the ILO, the International Labor Organization, child labor is defined as work that deprives children of their childhood, their potential and their dignity, and that is harmful to physical and mental development. In the U.S., child labor has been extinguished, but in the rest of the world, this is not the case. Many different sources have done studies on the amount of child laborers around the world. Although there are many different conclusions, it is roughly around 150 to 170 million. The highest number of these laborers can be found in the Asia-Pacific region, in countries such as Indonesia, India, and China, with 78 million. However, the highest percentage of child laborers occurs in Africa, with 21% of the child laborers being active in some form of labor. By and large, the most common form of child labor that children participate in is in agriculture, with over 60% of all child laborers. They work on farms, fish, and harvest wood, and help in producing livestock. One of the more dangerous sectors of child labor is the mining industry. Although the number of children in the industry is small, roughly about 100 million, it can't be overlooked because this number has been increasing in recent years. And with risks of injury, death, and violence, it needs to come to an end. Another cruel form of child labor is the use of children in armed conflict. Many children around the world are abducted and are given a gun told to fight. If not placed on the front lines, they may take place as a cook for the army. This type of child labor has taken place recently in Africa. Countries such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Central African Republic, Sudan, Syria, South Sudan, and Nigeria have been notorious for child soldiers. By far, the utmost reason for child labor is poverty. Parents are not cruel individuals that force their children into labor to earn an extra buck. 99.9% of the time, they choose to put their children into the workforce so that they can make it by and feed their family. Just by looking at where child labor occurs most frequently, one can see the evidence. Most of these countries are developing and are therefore many of the families are way below the poverty line. They rely on their children's help to get by. The second reason for child labor is poor schooling. In the U.S., each successive level of education equates to an increase in your potential income. This is not the case in other countries around the world. For example, in many countries within sub-Saharan Africa, the advance of education will not lead to a way out of poverty because of the poor schooling. Families understand this and so often decide that their children's time will be better spent earning an income instead. The problem of child labor has major effects on the world. One of the major effects that can be often overlooked when thinking about the eventual macroeconomic impact is that of the child. When a child goes into labor, they give up time that could have been spent in school. They forego an education that could expose them to opportunities which could be a way to make a better life for themselves. In countries where child labor is commonly found, this becomes a major problem. Many of these child laborers will continue into adulthood working in low-income jobs. This poses a problem for poor countries wanting to advance their economic output because many of the children in the country never end up in jobs or create businesses that will increase the GDP. This creates a positive cycle where the developing country, utilizing child labor to get it by, ends up keeping itself poor because the laborers have very little chance of succeeding afterwards. This positive cycle is very similar to what we see today within a lot of America's impoverished. Another effect is that it lowers the perceived cost of having children. With each child bringing in income for the family, parents may decide to have more children in order to increase the family's wealth. Unfortunately, at a certain point, this benefit becomes a disadvantage, with an increase in children costing the family more and more, which means more child labor. Fortunately, there have been many proposed solutions to end child labor and the devastating effects that go along with it. One of the most popular trends has been to boycott products that have been produced with child labor. Although this sounds like a viable option, it can do more harm than good. For example, when we hold the assumption that children are working because of financial needs rather than out of pure choice, a boycott will cut their wages or require the business to lay off many of them. An example of this occurred with child laborers in Bangladesh, where their employers fired them because of boycotts around the world. With less money, many of these children will end up going hungry or starve. We need to remember that these children are working because they have to, not because they want to. Another proposed solution is compulsory schooling. Although there needs to be other key components in place, such as an attractive schooling system and a government that enforces these new laws, when compulsory schooling is done right, it will alleviate the supply of child labor. Going hand in hand with compulsory schooling, improving the education system will also alleviate child labor. In many countries where child labor exists, there is very little incentive to get an education because it provides a small increase in wages. If the education system is improved, and a degree from a high school or college will be valued around the world, the incentive to send a child to school grows immensely, thereby taking them out of the workforce and putting them in school. The last solution I will be talking about is cash transfers. Cash transfers are a way of tackling poverty at the source. The process involves governments handing out money to families that meet certain requirements, such as having a child in school. With more money, families can afford to have their child in school rather than in the workforce. Some economists argue that the money will be spent to further increase the productivity of the child laborer, such as buying more cattle. But the research has concluded that cash transfers do reduce child labor on all levels. With all this talk of child labor, it's essential to understand why reducing it is important. First, child labor has been a part of our country's history. Children worked in the mines and in textile factories in terrible conditions. Large efforts were made to stop this from happening ever again, which makes us question why it should still be happening in other countries. Secondly, by reducing child labor, we could put more children into schools. With more children in schools, the potential productivity of the world will increase as more adults become literate and able to contribute their efforts to society in meaningful ways. Lastly, it's an ethical issue. Many of these children are participating in extremely dangerous jobs that risk their long-term health and safety. We can't understand what it's like to live in one of these countries where child labor is prevalent. Knowing what it's like to live without the burden of extreme poverty living over our heads should help push us to help those that do live in these impoverished conditions. Thank you for listening.